Hello, I'm Richard Bush, a partner in the International Sports Group at Bird & Bird, where I head up our Safeguarding in Sport practice. Welcome to this latest episode of our podcast series, Safeguarding What Sport Needs to Know. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by representatives from the Cricket Regulator, the Lawn Tennis Association and the Rugby Football Union, where we'll be discussing the history and development of safeguarding in those sports, their approach to case management, challenges they face in information sharing, and recent initiatives that they've undertaken. So let's hear what the speakers have to say.
My name's Dave Humphrey. I'm the Head of Safeguarding and Integrity for the LTA. I cover anti-doping, anti-corruption and safeguarding. My background, I was in the police for 15 years, working up to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector, in charge of child protection teams across West London, before moving to, at the time, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, inspecting police forces on their child protection arrangements, before moving into tennis.
Hello, I'm Sara Niblock. I'm the Director of the Anti-Discrimination Unit and Safeguarding team at Cricket Regulator, which is delivered on behalf of the England and Wales Cricket Board. Prior to being in cricket, I worked for the FA in a similar safeguarding role. I was also the Deputy Director at Refuge, which is a national charity for domestic violence. And prior to that, most of my career has been spent in policing, working in public protection, safeguarding child protection.
Hi, I'm Vivien Rimmer. I'm Head of Safeguarding for the RFU. I'm a qualified and registered social worker and have been for 25 years or so, and spent most of my time in statutory social work, so specialising in child protection and working with children living away from home. I got into the RFU in 2018, and actually just before I joined the RFU, I was principal social worker and head of safeguarding standards for 3 local authorities. Rugby's in my blood, I guess. I come from Bath, so it couldn't really be anything else. I started playing when I was 14, but in the 1980s, so way before women's rugby was under the auspices of the RFU. So joining, I guess, the RFU was a really great opportunity, too good to miss, to kind of perfect clash of personal and professional passions.
So to start with, I think it'd be helpful for listeners to hear about the development of safeguarding in sport in, as I say, some of the UK's biggest sports. So if you're able to tell us a bit about the history and development of safeguarding in your respective sports, and perhaps if I could ask Viv you to answer that question first.
Prior to joining today, I sought some advice actually from our safeguarding compliance officer, who has, believe it or not, been in post for over 20 years. So I thought he was a good place to start in terms of thinking around kind of what safeguarding looked like in rugby. And Chris joined us shortly after the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman and the subsequent Bishard inquiry. And I think that probably indicates, I think when he joined, probably there was one other person who had responsibility for safeguarding. Safeguarding sat in our, I think at the time it was the RFU's equality, welfare and medical team, something like that. And actually all of those departments now have separate departments rather than kind of all trying to be working together. And I think that at that point, safeguarding was probably less complex than it is now. I think the types of cases were probably a little bit simpler and mainly dealt with concerns that we had within the sport rather than thinking around some of the things that might happen outside of it. The experience and professionalism, I would suggest, of the safeguarding team has absolutely developed over time. And although actually our safeguarding team is probably smaller than some of the other colleagues that we have on today, we would try to think that we've brought in individuals with safeguarding experience across a variety of different roles, whether that be children's social care like myself or police or safeguarding indeed in other sports. We have a really broad brush, I think, from a safeguarding perspective. So I think we've learned over time that actually there is quite a lot to do in terms of thinking around case management as well as our more proactive safeguarding response.
Thanks, Viv. And Sarah, cricket's obviously undergone some major regulatory changes recently with the introduction of the Cricket Regulator, but perhaps you could tell us about how safeguarding has developed in cricket.
Yeah, of course, thanks. So I've been working for the England Wales Cricket Board for almost 6 years. When I came into the organisation, I think it was fair to say that safeguarding was a reactive response only. There were 4 members of staff looking after safeguarding on behalf of the whole of cricket, with some volunteer safeguarding officers out in the cricket network across the recreational game. So it was pretty limited in terms of its reach. It's developed significantly over the last 5 to 6 years. We're now on our second iteration of a safeguarding strategy, the most recent one being in December 2025, which runs in line with Cricket's Inspiring Generation strategy. And we have now a very proactive and preventative approach to safeguarding across the game. We've got a network of safeguarding professionals, paid safeguarding professionals across the whole of England and Wales, with requirements for them about what good looks like and standards that we need to meet. We've recently just finished our last safeguarding conference, and the theme of which was moving from compliance to culture, which I think demonstrates where cricket now sits in terms of its safeguarding development, that we expect standards to be met as a bare minimum now. And we expect that as business as usual. And what we're now supporting our cricket organisations across the game to do is to actually move towards good culture within those organisations and move away from just being about meeting standards, meeting compliance, ticking boxes, and actually moving towards embedding a culture of safeguarding across the game. So we've had huge development over the last 5 to 6 years. You've mentioned the point about the Cricket Regulator. So the regulator has now been established for the past 15 months. We were established in December 2024 to effectively deliver integrity, safeguarding and discrimination matters on behalf of the England and Wales Cricket Board. So we're ring-fenced from the rest of the organisation to ensure no interference with regulatory and safeguarding and integrity matters across the game. And that unit is still being effectively developed and resourced as we speak, but currently safeguarding sits within there.
Thank you, Sarah. And Dave, can you tell us about how safeguarding has developed in tennis?
Yeah, so when I came into post, I think it's 2017, we conducted a review of all our kind of historic case reports, and some of those dated back to the early 90s, so investigations were taking place as early as then. And then I guess throughout the early 2000s, we did have a small team of dedicated kind of safeguarding staff, similar to Sarah, a much smaller team than we have now. And I suppose we really began to develop our safeguarding work around 2017. We had a fairly high profile case in Wales. And as a result, there was a real focus on how we could kind of improve our systems, processes. So that led us to where we've come in the last 8 or 9 years. So we've seen our team expand pretty significantly now to encompass a safeguarding case manager and case officers on the reactive side, and then a proactive team of kind of 5 regional safeguarding officers, plus an officer in Wales and an officer in Scotland, led by our national safeguarding manager, who go out and meet people on the ground, complete audits of venues, work proactively with volunteers in safeguarding roles. Then, of course, we've got a network of dedicated volunteers in unpaid roles. So, for example, every county has a county safeguarding officer now. Every venue must have a trained venue welfare officer now. And then that, in and of itself, led to kind of another 2,500 safeguarding trained volunteers in venues. So we've expanded pretty significantly, similar to cricket, I think, in the last kind of 8 or 9 years.
Thank you. And this is a question for all of you, really. Do you feel that participants in your sport are increasingly receptive to the importance of safeguarding, the measures you're taking? And if that is a trend that you've recognised, when did that start?
I think within tennis, definitely. We began by kind of getting on board our council, the LTA council and counties, and by implementing the kind of county safeguarding officer role, that naturally spread the word around safeguarding to a volunteer base in the counties. And then from there, we expanded that into clubs with the club welfare officer role. And so naturally, when you have, as I said before, another 2,500 safeguarding trained volunteers across the country, it naturally starts to embed. I don't think we're there yet in terms of where we want to be. We're probably in a similar position to Sarah in that we're trying to now move from compliance to kind of a culture and embedding safeguarding culture across the sport. But I'd say it's night and day from kind of 8 or 9 years ago when we had the issues in Wales to where we've come now. And that's down to the work of a lot of volunteers as well as paid staff at the LTA.
I think that I would suggest that that's reflected within rugby too. So I think we've always been supported by an army of volunteers, whether those be our club safeguarding officers, where there's been an expectation that all clubs have, whether they are just doing age grade rugby or perhaps having 17-year-olds playing up into the adult game. There's an expectation that clubs have a club safeguarding officer, and our constituent body safeguarding managers have been in post for many years, long before the safeguarding team embedded within the RFU looks as it looks now. I think the difference is people having an understanding, perhaps, or developing their understanding of what safeguarding is and what they might need to be wary of and conscious of, not just around things that are going on inside the game, but those participants and what they bring to the game too. when we think around areas like, I don't know, the adverse childhood experiences, for example, that, children might bring into the game. There's a lot of work that's going on both by the RFU and with independent organisations such as the STAR scheme as well, which really help think around safeguarding being more than just child protection, if that makes sense, thinking around all of those things that we need to have in place to have a really good culture for protection and recognition.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Dave and Viv have said in this space. I think stepping into cricket and what I found with the reactive response is we went out quite early for conversations with the game and with our respective cricket organisations to say, let's have an honest conversation about where you think safeguarding is within your organisation and within your clubs, and actually let us support you to embed the standards that we need to see. So we've got our county partnership agreement, which is a legally binding agreement between the ECB and the relevant cricket organisations around where safeguarding standards need to be met. And we used that as a supportive measure to help the recreational game to get where they needed to be within safeguarding. We've gradually, over the last 4 or 5 years, professionalised the role of the county safeguarding officer. We've now got a fully paid county safeguarding officer network right across England and Wales, volunteer club safeguarding officers right across the game with requirements around that. So I think it is more understood now. We've given a huge amount of support, resources, guidance, training to all levels across the game to get them to where they need to be. There's also been influence at senior level as well. Buying needs to come from the very top. We've had that from our lead officers, CEOs across the game to make sure that the standards that we want to see are actually being driven throughout the game. So I think it's an approach from all angles, really, in terms of the operational delivery and the support that we give to the counties, and also from the senior level to make sure the importance of it is actually understood and recognised and actually delivered. So, yeah.
Thank you. One aspect of safeguarding regulation in sport is that there is no one universal way of approaching things, like there might be in the anti-doping context. Could you perhaps tell us a bit about your case management procedures?
Yeah, if I start with that. So similar to the LTA, we conducted a review of all non-recent cases when I came into the England and Wales Cricket Board to ensure that safeguarding cases are being completed appropriately. We took some decisions to reopen some cases and took some action on behalf of some of those cases. But like the other areas of safeguarding, it's been fairly transformative over the last 3 or 4 years. So we have a dedicated case management team looking after our safeguarding cases. All of those individuals come from an investigative background. We have very clear thresholds of the cases that we manage in the central team and those which we expect to be managed across the game. So the thresholds effectively set anything that reaches criminal threshold, anything that involves sexual misconduct, physical harm, and there are a number of other categories of thresholds. And effectively, we conduct safeguarding risk assessments as part of that case management process. We use appropriate technology now to record all of our cases, and we use the insight and the data from those cases to effectively set our preventative and proactive strategy and the work that our preventative staff need to do across the game in order to make sure that cases are managed appropriately and identify risk where it happens. We also report on low-level concerns across the game. So that was introduced in the last 12 months. We've asked our county organisations to report on their last 3 years' worth of data to, again, tell us what low-level concerns look like, where we've got themes, patterns, trends of concerning behaviour. We break down that data by county and also by role, so we understand if there are pockets of poor practice that are happening in certain areas of the country. We can target that approach with some resources, guidance, support, education and training. So the risk assessment process that we effectively use is that we're trying to establish the risk that an individual may pose to a child or an adult at risk across the game, and effectively not trying to prove or disprove a certain scenario has happened, because that may not be possible. What we're trying to identify is that, is this person appropriate to be working or volunteering or participating in cricket, and do they pose a risk to children or adults at risk across the game? So our process is now very clear. They sit within the published ECB safeguarding regulations and very clear and transparent process for how we manage those. We have independent safeguarding panels who effectively review all of our cases and have authority to impose sanctions and remove individuals from the game, or effectively set out some interim measures for that person that they must follow in terms of retraining, mentoring or other sort of steps in between disqualification.
Thank you, Sarah. And Dave, can you perhaps speak a bit about the LTA's case management procedures?
Yeah, quite a few similarities. All cases reported to us centrally via our case management system, which is all electronic now, allows us to track the data, very similar to cricket. And we manage all cases centrally as a case team, so we don't necessarily have a threshold as such. All concerns we encourage to be reported to us. We don't send cases out to be investigated locally, although in some certain instances we might suggest that a very low level matter might be best dealt with by a venue, but we'll still record it just for intelligence purposes. Once a case has been investigated under our disciplinary procedures, which actually we worked with your team, Richard, on, if the evidence exists, then that someone does potentially pose a risk of harm to a child or adult at risk, then I've got the power as the head of safeguarding to charge that individual. If they accept the charges and my proposed risk measures, because again, very similar to cricket, we don't implement punitive measures. It's all risk-based and the risk that individual may or may not pose. If they accept those risk measures and the charge, that's the end of the matter. If they dispute the charge or dispute the measures that I've suggested or the team suggested, then an independent panel is appointed, and those panels are led by a legally qualified individual with the support of 2 lay members who will have expertise in either our sports or safeguarding, and all of those were recruited independently. And then again, as we just heard, all the data we get from cases forms part of our proactive strategy as part of our 3-year safeguarding strategy, and it runs until the end of next year. So we're running proactive campaigns, for example, this year on peer-on-peer allegations, which we might come to later, as well as parental concerns is one of our key topics at the moment.
Thank you, Dave. And Viv, how about the RFU's case management procedures?
So similarly to the LTA, so our regulations state that all safeguarding concerns need to be referred to the RFU safeguarding team. So we have, again, a similar online referral form, which enables us, I guess, to triage concerns and to decide the best response. So just because everything comes through to us, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will require RFU case management. It might be that we ask our constituent body safeguarding managers to support, or club management of individual concerns. Just to emphasise really, and I'm sure it would be absolutely the same for both Sarah and for David, we will always make use of statutory agencies, and that might be children's social care or the police or the LADO, the local authority designated officer. And I think that if I was talking to any other sport, I would hope that they would have, really similar, really clear processes for that. So where we've got concerns in relation to a member of the children's workforce, I come from a LADO background, so just to be really clear. And so this is a particular passion of mine. We need to make sure with sports that we're using statutory agencies well and not going off into doing, investigations outside of that or without that kind of input and support. We've got a really mature, we call them referral management groups, so like a case management group, I guess, which has membership both for individuals inside and outside of rugby. So we have an independent social worker that sits, or a social worker who is independent of the RFU that sits on that. And we also have an independent chair. And actually his role is chairing local safeguarding children's partnerships as they are now outside of rugby. So we try to make sure that we are balanced in our approach, but certainly initially we will absolutely have a look at kind of the concerns that there are, making sure that we've got a proportionate response, but that we are absolutely meeting the requirements that are set out within statutory guidance.
Yeah, probably just need to clarify the point on the referral expectation. I probably didn't make that clear having listened to Dave and Viv. All referrals are required to come into the Cricket Regulator central safeguarding case management team. We triage those, and then we have a threshold for cases that are investigated and risk assessed by the central team, and those that sit below that threshold go back out to our cricket organisations with the support of our proactive team to manage. I think because we have that paid workforce now across the country, it gives us the resilience, I guess, within the game to be able to do that now.
Great. We've obviously already touched upon the importance of sport working alongside other agencies, and it goes, suffice to say, information sharing is a crucial aspect of effective safeguarding. We've advised clients and they've often faced challenges in respect of information sharing, whether wishing to share it with others or receiving it from others. So perhaps you could describe some of the challenges maybe you faced and hopefully also the solutions you found. Dave, maybe I can go to you first on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be a lack of understanding about the role of a national governing body and the importance of the work we undertake. So, the police or local authorities might conclude a case but not recognise that actually, as a national governing body, we do have quite far-reaching powers, for example, to ban someone from coaching, participating in tennis or paddle. So it's a useful tool. And I think something, kind of a tip or something that was really useful that came out of some work people on this call did with Op Hydrant is a letter from the NPCC, National Police Chief Counsel's lead for child protection, Ian Critchley, which he actually sent to all chief constables advocating for sharing of information with, for example, national governing bodies. So that letter we do have a copy of, so happy to supply that to other sports if they are struggling or having difficulties with obtaining information from the police, which can sometimes be an issue when they don't quite understand the role we are undertaking. We share information ourselves where it's relevant and necessary. So, for example, it's sometimes the case that matters we investigate, the alleged perpetrator is involved in another sport. In fact, many kind of venues that tennis is played at are multi-sport venues, and we'll obviously share with rationale in those cases. We have discussed as a group of kind of sports, including with tennis, rugby and football, around how we might better be able to obtain information. For example, if someone is removed or banned from a sport, you might not necessarily know about that if we don't have any information to suggest that they're engaged in another sport. So the answer to that, I know, Viv, this is something you tabled a little while back, might be that kind of some more information contained within DBS records so that we could perhaps see, for example, when someone is banned from a sport by a national governing body, and that information could then be sought from the national governing body. So that is one potential solution we've been considering.
And Viv?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that point, I find it really interesting. And I know that this can be a bit of a soapbox for me too. I feel like I've got a lot of them that I sometimes try and stand on. But, we have an obligation when we remove somebody from regulated activity to share that with the DBS. And we do. And I know other sports colleagues do also. But actually, when that person leaves rugby and decides they want to go and volunteer in tennis, unless the DBS, and we know that their threshold is pretty high, unless the DBS decide to remove that person from being, bar them from being able to engage in regulated activity with children, tennis will have no idea that we have removed them from the sport. And this isn't just around coaches. This could be, any position that's in regulated activity. But the DBS hold that information. And so my view is that, it would be wise for the DBS to feel, with a change in legislation probably, that actually they could share that without necessarily giving detail, but allow then that safer recruitment process to take place where tennis would have a conversation with us to say, actually, this person was removed from regulated activity with you, how, are either asking us for a reference or some more detail in relation to that. It feels like that would be the right thing to do. It's something that we would like to be able to think with other agencies. This obviously isn't within our gift to change that in terms of legislation, but I think it would be a better way of keeping children safe.
Thank you. And Sarah, what challenges have you faced, and have you got any top tips for how people might overcome those challenges?
Similar challenges, really. It's already outlined across tennis and rugby. I think probably the biggest frustration is the lack of consistency across the country with different police forces and different statutory agencies about how they're going to share information with us. We can go to a police force and obtain information from an officer in a case, and the following day go to a different police force and get a different response. So we're trying to work with the partnerships manager at Op Hydrant around some of the challenges that we face. And I think we've got a foot in the door with Op Hydrant now to raise awareness of some of the challenges for us. We've established, Dave alluded to, a cross-sport safeguarding group for some of the larger national governing bodies where we can share the challenges that we face as NGBs and how we can overcome them. And I think we've made good progress in some of the conversations that we've had. We're now talking to Sport England on a more regular basis as a group of NGBs around some of the challenges that we've got, to encourage them to work with us to deal with some of the many challenges that we face. But I think the biggest piece is the inconsistency across the game, as Dave said, that some statutory agencies may not even know the work that's being done across governing bodies in this space. We do have examples of statutory agencies going directly to recreational cricket clubs where we've got a volunteer safeguarding officer who will not have necessarily the expertise to manage that level of case. Fortunately, they understand the process that needs to come back into the central team, and we will pick those things up. But they tend to develop the kind of inconsistency, really.
I think that some of the challenges that we have that have been described are definitely inconsistencies around the country. And we, I guess, particularly thinking around cases where there have been no further action by police. We all know that no further action can be for a whole variety of reasons, and trying to make sure that we have information that we're able to use as a governing body when it comes to things that we might need. There might be, for example, something that's not met the threshold from a criminal perspective, but actually would have been a breach of our safeguarding policy or our regulations, and we need to use some of that information. And sometimes it can be really challenging to get the police to share that in depth. We use the LADO function again quite a lot in terms of trying to make sure that that information is shared within that remit, so that again we can use that information. But we want to try to be trauma informed too. If I've got somebody that's raised a concern and has given an interview to the police, for example, I don't want to traumatize that individual again necessarily by having to go through a whole interview process with them if the information is already readily available through another setting. And that can be really challenging sometimes in terms of making sure that we've got the right information at the right time. And there are perhaps some challenges too, not just with us receiving information, but sharing it as well. So there are some definite inconsistencies around the country around whether or not we are sharing information with consent of the people, particularly with children's social care, with the consent of parents, for example. Now, sometimes it's not for us to make a decision about whether or not sharing that information without consent might place a child at increased risk of harm. So we're working quite a lot with statutory agencies to really understand, and notwithstanding they're different around the country, to really understand actually that need for reporting, sometimes in that grey area of whether or not consent is required, can be really challenging. And it's something that we're working on, particularly with a couple of local authorities where we've experienced some difficulties.
Now, we've touched upon a couple of these issues already, and Viv, you've just mentioned the importance of being trauma-informed. So could you perhaps, each of you, tell us a bit about how you approach factual investigations where necessary, and as Sarah's already touched upon, in fact, you might have all touched upon the use of expert risk assessments in your processes. And Viv, maybe I could go straight back to you on that one.
Yeah, so I think what I'd say first is, although we are absolutely supported by this army of volunteers, we want our investigations to be professional. And so it will be professional staff that are undertaking those, with the exception of things that perhaps more readily sit under codes of conduct, for example, rather than meeting that threshold that requires a safeguarding investigation. We will do both in-house and external investigations. So I think, as I mentioned before, we've got our safeguarding team are experienced and professional. And so we'll undertake, the majority of our safeguarding investigations will be undertaken, notwithstanding those statutory agencies who may or may not have been involved at some point. We will do those internally, but we also make use of sports resolutions, and we will ask them to undertake some investigations for us. Sometimes that's because of capacity issues, if I'm honest, if we have a lot of cases where we need some external support to be able to support the case management function as a whole. And other times just because of perhaps the complexity of cases, maybe we need some direct one-to-one work, and we are all based in the main down in the southeast, and we might have investigations that are taking place in other parts of the country. So we'll use the expertise that we have. Our regulations allow for that in terms of sports resolutions. They also allow for us to be able to commission independent investigators. And before starting to use sports resolutions, we had several cases where we used external professional support, again, mainly to support our function from a capacity perspective, rather than necessarily a pure skill one.
Thank you, Viv. Sarah?
Yeah, similarly, really around risk assessment processes, mainly for individuals who've been through our independent safeguarding panel. And quite often, one of the options open to the safeguarding panel is to request a risk assessment is conducted to understand the level of risk that a person may pose towards children or adults at risk. And we will often commission external organisations to conduct those risk assessments, professional risk assessments on our behalf, so we can ensure that our panel are fully informed in terms of the work that they need to see and the risks that the individual may pose. So we utilise risk assessments for that purpose. And then in terms of our actual investigations, as I said earlier, we focus on risk as opposed to did person A do this to person B. We want to focus on all of the behaviours and understand whether that person poses a risk to children or adults at risk. So it very much is a risk assessment process as opposed to a punitive investigation where we're looking at did or didn't this person do the action that's stated.
And Dave?
I think we've certainly had to become more advanced and skilled in our investigations. So as police forces, social care kind of feel the pressure from additional cases. It's not uncommon now for us to have to investigate pretty complex cases that come to us potentially from the police who might have taken a decision to take no further action on a kind of beyond reasonable doubt burden of proof, whereas ours is obviously balance of probabilities. So we'd be left to investigate that case almost to the same level as a statutory agency. So as a result of that, we have all had to employ all our cases are now investigated by trained investigators, mainly ex-police officers, led by a very experienced former senior police officer as a case manager. And that's just because of the complexity of the cases we now manage, which I've definitely seen in the last 7 or 8 years. In terms of professional risk assessments, we've used them in non-recent cases when we're trying to establish the risk an individual poses now when perhaps the alleged offence might have been 10 years or more beforehand. But we also tend to use professional risk assessments in a more recent case where someone may be removed from the sport for a period of time as a risk management measure, but then to allow them back into the sport, a condition will be that they complete a professional risk assessment to assess the level of risk they pose, and then that then goes to a panel to assist them with their decision making and potentially allowing them back into the sport.
Thank you. Safeguarding cases are obviously by their nature can be very difficult, can be very sensitive. What support measures do you have in place for complainants, victims, survivors, and also in appropriate cases, those who are the subject of concern?
If I take that one in terms of how we support survivors, victims, those with lived experience, we've commissioned an external organisation to do a consultation for us with stakeholders, with victims and survivors, to establish the best way to work with them. And I use that in its broadest sense, not just within case investigations, but also work with them on a proactive scale. So we currently engage with all individuals who are subject to case management investigations and concerns to offer them a level of support, but felt that we needed to go further as national governing body for people that have come to harm, particularly in our game. And how do we acknowledge that? How do we continue to work with them? And how do we use their experience and voices to shape the work that we need to do moving forward? I think we felt that we had a gap in terms of understanding the experience that they've been through and how they've come to harm and translating that into our preventative strategy, and felt very much that we wanted to hear from those individuals to help us shape that. So we started that consultation piece of work in the last few weeks. We also have, in terms of those individuals subject to our case management procedures, we support those individuals with a named case officer who is available for them through the duration of the investigation and subsequently. And we signpost to external or support organisations for them. We also have a dedicated role for what we call managed participants. So those individuals who've been through our safeguarding panel and have some kind of sanction imposed against them following the procedure, whether that's retraining, disqualifications, those that want to come back into the game. And the managed participants officer role is primarily to manage the risk that individual poses, but also to work with that individual to understand what they want to achieve from being in the sport, where they want to come back into the sport. Do they want to coach? Do they want to just be a participant? How can we manage that safely? So that's a dedicated role that we have to support those individuals.
If I'm honest, most of our support is signposting. So we probably have a 3-step approach, both for those who might have experienced harm and for those where we have allegations that they might have perpetrated harm. So initially, everyone will be provided with support information. So we have either leaflets or guides in relation to national organisations and for explaining processes like LADO processes, for example. If an individual wants us to try to locate more local information for them, they have information to be able to get in touch with us directly, and I will try and source local information, or one of the case team will. And if that's not enough and there are additional supports, then we have the capacity to be able to look at additional support on top of that. Most of the time, the national or the local resource supports are appropriate. I think it's really tricky for the safeguarding team as such, because I think we have to probably recognise our own limitations and our own areas of expertise. I wouldn't want to be asking our case officers, for example, to be counselling individuals. That's not an area of expertise. And most of the time, those national organisations, both for those that are subject to concern and for those that might have experienced harm, those organisations or local organisations will be okay and will be able to provide, I guess, rather than being okay, will be able to provide the level of support that's necessary. But I'm interested in the work that's going on with other sports and other organisations around whether or not there's the need to commission something in-house. We haven't been asked to provide direct counselling or individual support yet to individuals outside of those organisations that might be possible to be accessed by individuals. To be fair, actually, on the information that we provide, we suggest that actually, it's really important that individuals think about their own support mechanisms that are there too, and obviously to be looking at accessing support through their GPs too.
In tennis, we do have a dedicated budget that provides therapeutic support, counselling support to people involved in investigations that people can access and have accessed in the past couple of years. And that's through an organisation called Sporting Chance that you might have heard of. I think Tony Adams had involvement with them. We've also recently, slightly off topic, but on a similar theme, Viv mentioned something there about people involved in investigations, the investigators themselves, and how certain investigations can affect them. And we've actually recently piloted a project with an organisation called Head Agenda, which is therapeutic support for those investigators on our team who are involved in safeguarding cases day in, day out, and particularly with the complexity and the nature of the cases they're managing now. We felt that was appropriate, and we'll be expanding that after a successful pilot, I think recommended by gymnastics actually. We'll be expanding that to our whole team now to provide some kind of workplace kind of support for those people to download in terms of the types of cases they're managing. So that's something we've just recently brought in.
Thank you. Now, some of the most challenging cases that we've been asked to advise on by our clients concern peer-on-peer abuse and cases where the subject of concern is themselves a child. Do you have any practical tips for other sports as to how you handle such cases? And maybe if I could go to you, Sarah, first on that one.
We do get a number of cases involving peer-on-peer abuse and those young people that are involved as perpetrating cases. And we often find in those cases that sometimes the young people themselves can have some additional and complex needs. We do find that parents will advocate very strongly on behalf of their child, understandably. And the priority for us is to make sure that we engage with the parents to understand how we can work with them to support the child through the process as well. I think, the dedicated case officer support network that we have is useful for the one kind of touch point for parents. But I think, as Dave said, in terms of a previous question, we have to understand what our role is. If we're dealing with something that meets the threshold of criminal investigation, then the police will take primacy in any investigation. We won't overstep that mark until the police case is finished. But if and when we do need to get involved, we will very much try and pick up a relationship with parents in terms of a good communication dialogue. Often all communication will go through parents unless, the young person and their consent from parents to be involved in that. But fairly difficult, I would say.
I don't know about advice, but I can tell you what we're doing about this, because this is the kind of case type that we're seeing probably the most increase in. And I know a few sports met recently with our case manager here, and they were experiencing the same kind of issues. And I think they present a different challenge, these types of cases, because we're about risk management, and you have to balance the needs of the young person with the management of the risk they might pose, what is typical age appropriate behaviour and what perhaps might make something slightly more risky for us as a sport. And it's challenging, and we're not experts. And actually, one of the things we've done is we've invited the Lucy Faithful Foundation to our offices to provide us a full day's training on this exact topic. So that will give us a much better understanding of the risk a young person might pose, how we can support both parties during the course of the investigation, but also ensure the best outcome, and that the risk management measures we're suggesting in our charge letters, if it gets to that stage, are actually appropriate. So in summary, this is definitely something which is on our radar. It's becoming increasingly case type that we're seeing more and more regularly. So we're going to be proactive in terms of trying to upskill the team to manage these types of cases.
I think just to add there, similarly, it's a case type that we're seeing slightly more of at the moment. What I would say is that when we communicate with parents, the young person still being involved in the sport is often very important to the young person themselves and the parents. And where possible, we do try to risk manage some kind of interaction still with the sport for the young person during that period of time, if it is safe to do so, because of the importance on that young person's mental health and well-being. So we do try and work with families to make sure that can happen safely.
Thank you. And Viv, from the RFU's perspective, is there any practical guidance on dealing with peer-on-peer cases?
I'm not sure about practical guidance. I mean, definitely from a theme perspective, we've moved on from perhaps when we were thinking around child-on-child issues, those being things around bullying and not adhering to rugby's core values and those kind of things, to issues associated with social media and WhatsApp and sharing images and, potentially contact offences too. What I would say when we're thinking around child-on-child issues, that it is really important, if I could give any advice, is to make sure that you have statutory agencies on board where at all possible. So thinking around working with those agencies, if these are children in need or they are children who are subject to child protection plans, thinking around team around the child planning, safety planning with those other organisations so that there is a shared responsibility. So rugby will be one of the activities, they may be at school and there may be safety planning that's already gone in place in terms of activities in school or within other agencies. And from my perspective, rugby is one thing that these children do, but they will be doing a whole host of other things, whether that's attending school or whether that's, going and doing dance or in a choir or whatever it might be. And so I don't want our response to be something that's happening in isolation. If we've got a young person, for example, that is able to, with a good safety plan in place, still attend school and not need, 24 hours supervision or whatever it might be, then that might be something that we can replicate within rugby too. If we've got a young person who is deemed to be so risky that actually they're not able to engage in activity within school, for example, then it's going to be very difficult for me to think that they are going to be able to safely engage in the game of rugby as well. We've probably got less resources from a rugby perspective than they might do within education. So working with those other agencies and seeing what information can be shared and then what support can be provided so that we're not working in isolation, would be my top tip.
So you're all, if I can butter you up, leading sports, established safeguarding functions. So with that in mind, could you perhaps tell me maybe about a safeguarding initiative you've run and how that's looked to improve safeguarding within your sport? And Dave, maybe if I could go to you first on that one.
Yeah, I mean, we've tried to focus on engagement with young people. So I think probably in the recent past, the thing that I think we're most proud of as a team would be the Young Person's Welfare Ambassador Scheme, which is a scheme that puts a young person in a tennis venue with the support of their venue welfare officer and with the task to raise awareness of safeguarding across young people at the venue. We've actually just finished recruitment. Just now we've got over 100 in post, with the target to double that to over 200 by the end of the year. Benefits for the young people are, a good thing to put on their CV. It's recognised as a volunteering activity by the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, gives young people confidence, skills they can use in their life. And obviously the benefits to the venue are increased awareness of safeguarding amongst young people. We know that young people often tell friends before anyone else if something is happening to them. And we've actually seen in the pilot of this project last year, double-digit rises in survey scores pre and post the young person being in post of awareness of who the welfare officer is, what they do, how to report concern, and what types of things might constitute inappropriate behaviour by coaches. So I think it's been a really good example of engaging young people in a tangible way. We've seen the young people do anything from kind of young person's notice boards, quiz nights, bag tags with info around safeguarding on. So they've generated some great ideas, and we've actually used that cohort then to move on to supporting the development of our young person safeguarding policy video, which is a short video which we're aiming to put across kind of key messages in the format that young people said would be more engaging. So that will be coming out this year. So I think our work with young people has been, something I've been really proud of, certainly in the last year.
Thank you. Viv?
I think I'd really like to give a bit of a shout out to some of the safeguarding training that we offer, actually. So we have worked really hard over the last couple of years to think about the safeguarding offer that we give to our club safeguarding officers. And what used to happen is that we have safeguarding tutors or others that kind of delivered safeguarding training for our club safeguarding officers. And we changed that a little while ago so that we delivered it in person. So it's delivered now by the safeguarding team. That's usually me, for right or wrong, along with another member of the safeguarding team, with the idea actually that we could then be seen by our club safeguarding officers as being a little bit more accessible. So we're not stuck in some ivory tower somewhere at the Allianz. We are, it's much easier, I think, to have a conversation, to check something out, to just be able to raise a concern in a way that has an element of just being curious, I guess, about whether or not something else might need to happen. And having availability, I guess, in terms of people being able to see that, as I say, we are accessible has had a real impact, inevitably, after safeguarding training. And we deliver the training every month, at least, usually a couple of times a month for the first few months of the season. We definitely see an increase in contact with us afterwards, conversations afterwards. We've widened that training out more recently. So actually others in positions of trust within the club are encouraged to attend. So club committee members that may or may not have any designated safeguarding responsibilities within their role. And we try to focus on culture as well as the practicalities in terms of thinking around reporting and safer recruitment. So I think, David, as you mentioned, when we have a particular focus on the voice of the child within that training, thinking around how we can have a club that's as child-friendly as possible. And we spend quite a long time actually talking about the fact that children need to have a voice within rugby that sits outside of safeguarding. So they need to experience really positive messages, I guess, around being able to raise issues that have nothing to do with safeguarding. So being able to say, actually, I really hate the fact that, sausages are served after rugby and we'd really like burgers every now and again, or I really don't like that warm up that we do, or whatever it might be, but experience being able to use their voices and that being welcomed and listened to about things that have nothing to do with safeguarding, in the hope that if there are safeguarding concerns, they've already had such a positive experience of raising something and having their voices heard within the game that it doesn't feel so much of a challenge for them to raise a safeguarding concern. Because we know, don't we, that if a child has never experienced being able to have a voice at all, then we can't have any assurance at all that they're going to feel confident to raise a safeguarding issue when it comes up. And we've done, as I say, a lot of work with clubs to think about mechanisms, whether or not that be, we haven't got anything as formal as the ambassador scheme, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. But thinking, we've got a club who have got, a 16-year-old that they appointed as their age grade chair, which is lovely because actually they've been supported in that role and they've been able to have a think about the ways in which they have a real voice within their club. So things like youth councils and youth groups are something that we are absolutely promoting through the game.
And Sarah?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that voices of young people are absolutely critical in this space. We've done some work with young people from 2 schools, from diverse backgrounds, to ask them what helps to make them feel safe and actually be safe. And we've played that back to senior leaders across cricket and the importance of the young person's voice in the room. We've also recently, working with Lion Culture, we've placed 30 of our county safeguarding officers onto the Lead Safeguarding Officer programme that's run by Lion Culture. They're going to be attending this year in 2 cohorts, and we've got the remaining county safeguarding officers next year. So that's an initiative that we funded centrally to ensure that we give our safeguarding officers across the cricket network the skills to build and develop the strategic approach to safeguarding that they need and to be able to influence the senior leaders in their organisations. So I'm really proud of that piece of work, that we're committing the resource to that. And I think we will see the benefits from that in the years to come. We're also working across the game, the recreational game, particularly around mental health first aid training to support safeguarding adults in our proactive approach. By the end of next year, we will have trained 800 people across the recreational game around mental health first aid. And we're now working with an organisation called Opening Up in Cricket, who have a very specific remit around mental health and suicide, particularly among men, to support the ongoing work in that space. So there are a number of initiatives that are going on proactively to support the embedding of safeguarding across the game.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Viv. Thank you, Sarah, for taking the time out of your day to share your insights and experience with me and, of course, the listeners to the podcast. One final question to wrap things up. If I were able to give you a magic wand to change one thing in either your sport or sport generally that would improve safeguarding, what would it be?
I don't know that I've got anything in terms of magic wand stuff, because my list would probably be too long and that's not particularly helpful. I think if I was giving any advice to another sport or others, and if I'm even in a place to give advice, I think I would say plan for things in a time of calm and not a time of panic. I think sometimes change happens as a response to something going wrong. And what we want to do is to learn about what's happened in other sports and outside of sport. I think sometimes sport thinks that kind of it's, we can be quite insular. But actually, I think somebody described it to me not so long ago as striking whilst the iron is cold. And I think that's a really good mantra. We need to be brave enough, I think, to have a look at kind of what we're doing within our individual sports and not think that we're there yet. Safeguarding is it's never done, I guess. And I think that if you think it's done, whether it's in your sport or your organisation, it's probably time to move on. I mean, I remember first joining the RFU, and that's back in 2018, and having a conversation with somebody really early on when they asked me basically what we needed to do to make sure that we were compliant and all of those things. And I think that came on the back of me talking about some of the work that we needed to do really to meet the obligations of working together to safeguard children. And they made reference to health and safety and fire doors, and you change a fire door and then you're compliant. And I guess I still have the conversation with individuals trying to explain that safeguarding is kind of ever evolving, and legislation, I think, probably takes an eternity to catch up. I mean, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have had some of the conversations that we've had today in relation to the safeguarding world around, WhatsApp or sharing digital imagery or those kinds of things. And we have to evolve to mitigate against those risks. So it's never going to be done. And whether that's widening our scope or thinking around kind of how we safeguard adults in sport and not just children and all of those things, it's always going to be ever evolving. And thinking around those changes, as I say, in a time of calm and not a time of panic would definitely be a top tip, which is not the question you asked, Richard.
No, but it's a good answer.
I think mine would be around influencing the decision makers. As with anything across organisations, the culture is set from the person at the top of the organisation and from the exec at the top of the organisation. And it's absolutely critical that safeguarding is within their remit. They understand the challenges, but not only understand it from the firefighting risk perspective, they also understand that it needs investment. And as Viv says, strike while the iron is cold. Invest early, invest well, put your resources in, and you will reap the benefits. I think from all three of our organisation, we have seen the benefits across each of our respective sports of the investment, the resource, the guidance, support that's been put in, and the hard work that's gone into understanding how to embed a culture of safeguarding across our sports. So I think investment, it's difficult sometimes for senior leaders to invest in something where they think there isn't a problem. And that's where we need to be influential. That's where we need to bring in the right people to influence the decision makers so they understand the benefits that good safeguarding can bring to their organisations. And I talk to the CEO regularly here. Once a month we meet together to talk about safeguarding, and we talk about the broader benefits of safeguarding. We do this well, we increase participation, we help people to feel safe, we help that they are safe, and actually we support the ECB's mission to be the most inclusive team sport. We don't have a safe organisation. You don't have a sport, effectively. So it's a really timely piece for senior leaders to understand that safeguarding needs investment in the early stages to reap the benefits of it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd echo those comments. I mean, in terms of what you both said, if there isn't a major catastrophe happening in safeguarding, a tendency perhaps can be everything's okay, but I think you have to keep your eye on the ball, and that's why we always have safeguarding as a standing item at every single board meeting, and that won't change. I suppose if I had a magic wand, I would say probably two things. First of all, more conversations like this, because I think sports, we don't necessarily see each other enough and have kind of formal get-togethers, because you learn a lot from just talking to other sports. Like, for example, the suggestion of Sarah's mentioned there around putting the CSOs onto the Lyme Culture program, that's got me thinking. So you always learn something, and then that best practice can go and be progressed into other sports. And I suppose the second thing, if I had a magic wand, would be for everyone who sees something, however minor, that concerns them, that they would report it. Because I would still say that, across all sports, probably there are still people who might feel that I shouldn't report that because I'm not sure it's anything that bad. I'm not sure. I know them, they're my friend, but no major kind of case or no serious allegation ever, I think, came from nowhere. There was always a build up. There was always signs beforehand. So I would just wish that everyone who has even the most tiniest of concern reports that to the experts to take it off their hands and make the relevant kind of inquiries on that for them, so they don't have to make that judgment.
And in fairness, maybe I shouldn't have given you a magic wand. Maybe I should have given you each a genie, a lamp, and 3 wishes. But very good answers. Thank you very much. So with that, thanks once again, Dave. Thanks once again, Viv. And thanks once again, Sarah. And I hope for the listeners that was interesting, useful, and insightful. And as Dave just said, a great conversation to have. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
It was good. Thank you.